Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf Nun Vav. This week's learning is sponsored by Miriam Adler in honor of their new grandson Netu, whose family was evacuated from Kibbutz Sad. His name symbolizes the hope that there will be rejuvenated life and growth in the Yotef and all of Israel. Amen. Okay, I'm going to remind everybody what I mentioned yesterday, that we now have a new content on our website, certainly for the next 2 weeks, maybe even longer, from Dr. Alana Stein-Hain. We'll be having weekly shiurim right now, more in-depth conceptual perspectives on the daf. The first topic, a very fascinating topic of what we're going to start off with today, about patur midinei adam v'chayav b'dinei shamayim. What exactly does it mean to be chayav b'dinei shamayim, liable in the heavenly court? There are multiple views of how to view this. So she analyzes some of them and gets into conceptual framework about what exactly this means. You can find it on our site, on YouTube, the website, on Hadran's website, and we started a new podcast channel. So if you like to listen by podcast to the shiurim, then you can subscribe. It's called Beyond the Daf. You can find it on most of the podcast applications. Seems to be an issue with Google Podcasts, but Google Podcasts apparently is finishing up and is going to turn into YouTube. There's some YouTube channel type thing. I don't understand all of it yet, but so I'm not sure it will ever be up on Google Podcasts, but you can use other podcast applications. You should be able to find it there. It's called Beyond the Daf. And the new column is called Din and Daf, okay, which is about law and the Daf and conceptual framework of that. Okay, with that, we will get started. And by the way, I told you, if you like Alana's stuff, she's coming out with a new book, and we actually sent out a discount code. If you haven't gotten it yet, you can ask us about it, and we'll be sending it out a little more widely at all the communities later today. Okay, with that, Tanya, Amal Rabbi Yehoshua. So let's start back with this braita. We had a braita yesterday with 4 cases. Let's go over the 4 cases again. There's 4 situations, which later we're going to see there's a lot more than 4. But right now the braita tells us there's 4. Part of our question is going to be obviously why these 4 and why didn't it mention all the others, where you are going to be exempt in a court of law, but chayav b'dinei shamayim, which again is very hard what exactly that means. Does that mean you're really obligated, right? It could be somewhere on a range between you're not really obligated, but it's a good thing to do, like lifnim meshurat hadin, right? Or it could be you're actually obligated. We just can't make you do it in a court, but you actually are really obligated. So, and then something, there could be some range in between what all this means. Again, not enough for what we have time for in daf, but that's why we have the extra content. What are they? Elohim. And we got to this because the first one seems like the case in our Mishnah, although we're going to see right now that Rashi doesn't explain it like the case in our Mishnah. So let's see what that is. Now, because we're in the middle of our Mishnah, we assume that what does this mean? If you break down a fence that somebody put up to block their animal from getting out, and their animal gets out and causes damage to someone else, theoretically you're liable for the damage, but it was indirect damage, so you're not liable. But Rashi actually doesn't explain it that way. Rashi explains it, interestingly. If you read Rashi, let me just find it. Haporetz gader, my Gemara, it's about 5-6 lines from the bottom of Rashi. V'yatzta'ah habehema ubarcha. And you actually got the animal lost. By opening the gate, you let out the animal, and now the animal's gone. And you caused a loss, not that you caused damages to some third party, but you actually caused a loss to the owner. So it's unclear exactly what this case is and what exactly we're saying that you're liable in the heavenly court and not in a court of law of humans, right? There's a range of what this is referring to. When we get to the Gemara, you'll see the Gemara on this braita. We're in the Gemara, but the Gemara right now is in a braita. They're going to actually talk about something else, and it's quite a confusing sugya, I will tell you, and there's many different interpretations here. Again, because we're not doing an in-depth analysis, we don't have time to get into all the ins and outs of what the pros and cons of each approach are, but that's what you would really do in an Iyun Shiur. You'd say, okay, why does this one read it this way? And why does that one read it that way? And what are the weaknesses and strengths? And also, by the way, what are the conclusions you could come to if you say that that's what this means? Maybe you'd be liable in the court of law for something else. So there's a lot of lack of clarity here. I will just kind of put it out there. So if you walk out a little confused by it, you'll see why. They have standing stalks of wheat, and you bend them down, and there's a fire on its way, and you cause it to be burned by the fire. You hire false witnesses to testify. You know testimony, and you don't testify about it. And this comes up, by the way, in Shvuot, and it comes up in the Tosefta in Shvuot, and it comes in the opposite order because the main thing is the edut. Okay, that's the 4 cases. Now we're going to get into these 4 cases. Amar. So we're now at almost at the last line of Nun Ham Bet. What's the case? If you had a very solid fence, wall, okay, they seem to be interchanging fence, wall, it doesn't really matter. But you had a very solid wall. Then, even b'dei adam, he should be obligated. Now, obligated what? What does this have to do with a wall? So Rashi explains, and I'm going to show you right away why Rashi is a very difficult shot to read here, which is adam nami lichayev mia akotel dehabi yadayim avid. Because our Mishnah said partu alistim patul. Comes Rashi and he says, based on our Mishnah, partu alistim is exempt entirely. So it can't be that that's what they're referring to the animal. What they're saying is, if you had a solid wall and somebody comes and breaks the wall, while they might be exempt from your animal who gets lost, because that's grama, indirect damages, but you're still liable in a court of law for the damage you caused to the wall. Okay, now we'll say, what does one have to do with the other? That wasn't what they were talking about. When they talked about exempt from in a court of law, but liable in a court of heaven, they were talking about regarding the animal. And you're talking about now regarding the wall. 2 totally different things. So the way Rashi understands it is, because this is talking about being exempt from this action, it must be you're exempt entirely in a court of law. And therefore it can't be talking, we can't say, oh, you're exempt from a court of law for the lost animal, and that the braita meant, but you are liable for the wall, the damage you did to the wall. Like, it doesn't make sense. If they're saying from this action you're exempt, it must be you're exempt from any kind of anything that you cause. So therefore, even though we're talking about 2 totally different things, and that's the obvious weakness in Rashi, some people explain it differently, which again, there's many different interpretations. First of all, there's a scale of what could be going on here. Number 1, there's liability for the wall. Number 2, there's liability if the animal gets lost. Number 3, there's liability if the animal damages. So in the different interpretations, they kind of pick one or the other or both, or and it could be different possibilities. And that's because there's a range of possibilities of what it could be. It causes some confusion here, what we're talking about. So some people claim that we're talking about the animal, let's say, getting lost. And the question is, if you had a kotel bari, a solid wall, and they broke it, and then the animal got lost, that's already more direct damages, because you did all you could to protect, or maybe even the animal damaging. You did all you could to protect the animal from damage, and someone else now pretty much caused the animal to damage, because they broke the wall, a wall that was a totally solid wall, and therefore maybe we could obligate them for the damages to the animal. So there's different ways of reading this. I'm going to leave it at that, as kind of up in the air what exactly how this connects with the previous, with how we read it, the simple. Anyway, we'll leave it at that. So it can't be that case, because there is some sort of liability in a court of law, whether for the wall or whether for the damages caused to the animal. The obvious strength of Rashi is the only thing that's really obvious you have to pay for is the wall, because no matter what, all the other damage is indirect. And we said indirect damages you don't pay for. So the question is, where do we fall on the scale of direct, indirect? So there are some indirect damages you could be responsible for. Maybe this goes there. Again, this is a quite confusing sugya. I don't like to confuse you too much, but I am leaving it out there that it's hard to follow the simple reading of this sugya. It must be a kotel that was about to fall anyway. And when you have a kotel ra'ua, if you remember, the owner is actually obligated to knock it down. So if you go with Rashi, this works very simply. You basically say you're not obligated for the wall, because the wall would have fallen down, was supposed to be broken anyway. This is like we have mana tavira tavar back in the Adam Wa'alolan sugya, the person throws the kli and the other person smashes it with a baseball bat. And then you say, well, you broke a broken kli, it was going to break anyway. You're not liable, right? And that's what we're going to say here. It was a kotel that was going to fall apart anyway, and then you're not liable. Obviously, well, then maybe you should be liable even in the court of a heavenly court, because the wall was going to break anyway. So, you have to explain, well, maybe it wasn't, ready. He still got use out of it for another few days. It's still worth something to him, to the owner. Or again, you could say, well, it was a kotel that was weak, which meant that the owner was somewhat negligent about it also, because he didn't take care of his wall, if you're talking about, and then the animal went out and damaged. So it's somewhat your fault, but also somewhat not your fault, because it already was a weak wall that maybe the animal himself could have knocked down. So again, it's not 100% clear, but the Gemara in the end basically says this is only in a case where the wall was weak already. These cases are going to be a little bit more straightforward. So you bend the grains down, which is going to cause them to burn. If the fire is getting there by a regular wind, and it's going to, because you bent it, it's now going to reach to there by a regular wind, then of course you should be liable. You're basically directly causing the damages. It must be, answer number one for this case is, it was an atypical wind that brought the fire over to where you bent it. So again, you caused it indirectly because you weren't really expecting a wind to come, and that's why B'dinei Shamayim will make you liable, but not in the law of man, in a court of law. Rav Ashi Amar Tamun, if you remember, there's a special exemption by hidden stuff in the field. Now, what did you do? You took the standing grain and you buried it underneath something. You bent it and buried it underneath something. So now when the fire that was expected to come, because we're going to assume this isn't the previous answer, what wasn't expected, the fire that's expected to come is going to now burn this stuff, but the person who lit the fire is actually going to be exempt. So this is where we're going to say, well, you actually caused the exemption, and therefore this person is not going to get paid for their grain that got destroyed, and it's because of you. But since you didn't actually put the fire there, and you just caused this exemption in a weird kind of way because you buried it, we're going to make you only liable in a heavenly court and not in a human court. So itmar mishum deshavia tamun be'esh. Okay, amar tamun itmar. This was talking about tamun because mishum deshavia tamun be'esh, because you caused it to be called tamun, which is going to exempt the person who created the fire, right? So again, you're causing a loss to someone, but in an indirect manner. So there's two ways to understand that case. Amar hasocher edei sheker. If you hire false witnesses, hechidami. What's the case? If you hire them for yourself and basically got yourself off the hook for something by having false witnesses say you don't owe money. Of course, you have to pay back the money. You hire false witnesses to basically exempt you from some payment. Of course, you're going to have to pay that money. What it must be is you testify for someone else. So you actually didn't get, if you get monetary benefit, of course, you have to return that monetary benefit. But if you hire false witnesses for your friend to testify for your friend to get your friend off the hook for something, then again, it's indirect damages because there was no money that you saved or, got. So therefore, you're not going to be obligated again in a court of law, but yes, in a heavenly court. For you have to learn the difference between two witnesses and one witness. Two witnesses testify that, let's say Ruth owes Naomi money, Ruth will have to pay Naomi. If one witness comes and testifies, let's say no witnesses come. No witness come. Naomi claims, Ruth, you owe me money. Ruth says no. Ruth doesn't have to pay because I'm right? The burden of proof is on Naomi to prove that Ruth owes her money, right? Whatever this may be, whether it was a loan, that Ruth owes her money back from a loan, or it was damages, the burden of proof is always on Naomi, right? We learned that many times. If there's one witness, now one witness is not enough to incriminate in a court of Jewish law, but it is enough to require an oath. So if, let's say, Naomi claims that Ruth owes her money, and I come and claim that Ruth owes Naomi money as a single witness, then Ruth actually will have to pay unless she takes an oath. In other words, she's now obligated to take an oath. If she takes an oath, she can get herself out of it. She says, I know I don't owe you money, and I swear in a court of law, she can be exempt. So that means really, if she doesn't swear, she actually has to pay. So by my knowing testimony, and that's what we're going to get to right now, it must be one witness. Let's read it inside. If I don't testify in court, I know testimony, and there's another witness who can come with me to court, and I don't go, which means, either the one witness is going to go, or maybe that witness doesn't go either. But the main point is I don't go to basically definitively make Ruth liable to pay Naomi back. Obviously, I've done something terrible, b'dinei shamayim. You don't even need to tell me this. Pshita doraita, because the Torah says this is usher. The Torah says, im lo yagiv v'nasa no. If you don't give testimony that you're supposed to, then you have a sin on you, and you actually have to bring a korban chatat. You have to bring a sin offering. It's clear that you have some sort of responsibility in the heavenly court. So the braita doesn't need to tell us something that's explicit in the Torah. Ela bechad must be talking about one witness. And one witness, if I am a single witness in this case, and I don't come forward and testify, I'm actually causing a loss to Naomi. But it's not a direct loss because right? Ruth can either take an oath and then not have to pay Naomi, right? Or she cannot take an oath and then she'd have to pay Naomi. So if she chooses, let's say Ruth is really lying, she probably won't take the oath. And then I cause Ruth to pay Naomi. So if I don't testify, I'm actually causing Naomi a big loss. So that's what I'm liable for in a heavenly court. We can't really make me liable in a human court because first of all, I didn't really do anything. I just didn't testify, right? And also, by the way, who knows whether I know this testimony or not, right? Almost like only God knows. Okay, those are our 4 cases. Each case we had to explain a little bit better what exactly is the scenario, because what they're really struggling with in most of the cases is why aren't I obligated in a human court, right? In a court of law. Bitulek, second part of our Gemara is to say, wait, but aren't there more cases? And here we're going to list V'ha'ika, and here's a siman. If you do any sort of malacha work with either the water for the para aduma water, it's right where they mix it with ashes, or the parat chatat, the actual red heifer that we're going to use, you're not allowed to work them at all. Okay, this is asher lo alah aleha ol. It has to be an animal that was you never put a yoke upon it and worked it in the fields. By the water, it says l'mishmeret l'meini dad, has to be watched for this purpose, and you can't use it for anything else. What would you use it for? Rashi says, like putting it on a scale, let's say. Like it's X weight of water, and then you put it on a scale to weigh other things against it. That would be using it for work. Now, if you use them, they can't be used anymore for the paraduma waters. So now, for the paraduma sprinkling. So now you've ruined it, basically, but it's hezek she'eno nikar. Now, you might remember, we discussed this already. We saw it in Gitin. We saw it also before earlier in our Masechet. It's damages that you can't see. Nobody can see that this was used on a scale. Nobody can see that this animal was used for plowing, right? It doesn't change the animal and the way the animal looks. It's not like you put a blemish in the animal. So, which is obviously noticeable. This is not noticeable. So we learned already that there's machloket. Are you patur or chayav? And if you say patur, though, you're actually liable in a heavenly court. So that's the case. Patur midinei adam v'chayav b'dinei shamayim. Va'ika, another case. Hanoten sam hamavet b'fnei beimat chavero patur midinei adam v'chayav b'dinei shamayim. If you put poison in front of an animal and then the animal eats it, we saw this not so long ago, you're exempt from human law because in the end, the animal did the action of eating it, but you caused it. Again, it's a classic case of grama, indirect damages. Va'ika, doesn't it say hasholech get? Sorry, I don't know why I said hasholech get. Hasholech et be'era biyad cheresh shoteh v'katam patur midinei adam v'chayav b'dinei shamayim. If you take a fire, okay, now there was a big debate about this. Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish, was it a torch or was it a coal? And you gave it to a cheresh shoteh v'katan, someone who's not considered responsible. And then they created a fire. You're actually, even if you did it with your animal, you'd be liable. If you did it with fire, you're patur midinei adam and chayav b'dinei shamayim. Remember, we had a whole sugi about this. Why are they different? And we said 2 options. Either Rabbi Yochanan says it's the shalhevet, and because in the end they take the shalhevet and they do an action with it by spreading the fire, we can't make you fully responsible for it, and therefore only in the heavenly court. Or Rish Lakish says, no, you just took a coal, and the coal, as it goes on, it cools down, and because of that, you're already not going to be as responsible because the coal cools down, and therefore, if they must have done some action, right, to fan it to make it get hotter again, and therefore you can't be held responsible for that. If you shock someone and they get so shocked that it causes damage to their body, like you make a loud sound, and then they go deaf, not because of the physical that you actually caused some injury to their ear, but because they went into a state of shock and the shock caused them to go deaf, let's say. So now, why are you not responsible? If you remember, it's because we say they're somewhat to blame for their response to hearing that noise, right? It's not a noise that would cause everyone to go deaf. It was just more that they themselves got themselves into a state of shock, again, whether they could control that or not. And that's exactly why this is in between. In the heavenly court, they'll make you liable, but not in the human court. And again, it also depends on what you view of your responsibility in the heavenly court, what that means and where the range is. Again, recommended to listen to Alana's Shiur, and you'll hear the different ranges of opinions there. Okay, next. Nishbera kado b'reshut harabim v'lo silka. Your cod breaks in the public domain and you didn't remove it, right? We had a whole debate what exactly the details of this case are. I'm not going to go into them right now, but or nafla gam lo v'lo ha'mido, or your camel fell and you didn't pick it up. Rabbi Meir mechayev b'hezekam. Rabbi Meir thinks you're liable, but chachamim omrim patur midinei adam v'chayav b'dinei shamayim. Okay, this could be because, right, you're unos for the fact that it got there in the first place, and therefore we don't make you responsible for what happens after. There's a whole range of opinions there, but we're going to leave it right now. So the rabbi, it's another case of patur midinei adam chayav b'dinei shamayim. So basic question, why aren't these mentioned in the braita? To which the Gemara answers, in mi'ikatu. But yeah, there are more cases. We don't deny it. The braita agreed that there are more cases, but why did it mention specifically these? Because our four cases are unique in the sense we're different from these other cases, because our cases, there was more likelihood you might think you're not even liable in a heavenly court. And that's why the braita wanted to say, in cases where you don't think, right, yeah, there's more cases, but there it's more obvious that you've done something wrong, that you're going to be held liable for in some way. These cases you might have thought not at all. And now we're going to have to do the same thing we did before, which is go through all four cases and explain why you might have thought that you're not even liable. So, how so? Now, if you knock down this wall and the animal again gets out and injures or gets out and gets lost, well, we already explained there was a case where the wall was going to fall down anyway. So you might say, look, the wall was going to fall down anyway. Why are you making me responsible for anything? It was a wall that would have broken anyway, so I'm not liable. Again, question is, are we talking about liability for the wall? So you could say the wall was going to break down and it was going to break anyway. I was thinking about how now we pay money to knock down walls, right? We pay someone to knock down the wall. You actually did the guy a favor, but okay, let's assume it doesn't really cost money to knock down that wall. And right, so maybe you're not even liable in a heavenly court, okay? Or you could say because the wall was going to break anyway, the animal got out on your account, but it would have gotten out anyway because the wall would have been down, right? Again, complicated exactly what this is referring to. Hakofef kamato shel chavero, no, mao detema, again, same thing. You might think, lema mihava yadana da'at yiroch she'ena mitzuya. It was only when I bent it down, it was only going to be if it got hit by a tornado. But who knew? I didn't listen to the news. I didn't know there was a tornado. Watch out. I had no idea that that was coming. How was I supposed to expect that? I didn't do anything wrong. Kamash malan, no. You should have been aware that it could have, you knew there was a fire somewhere and you should have realized that since there is some way it could have gotten there and you made it get to here, you're responsible. Now, what about Ravashi? Damal nami tamun itmar. He said you buried it. So that has nothing to do with the ruach she'ena mitzuya. Ma'u detema ana kisuya kisute niala. Ubedina shamayim namel l'chayv. Maybe you could say, listen, I covered it. Why did I cover it? Because I thought the fire wouldn't get to it if I covered it. And maybe I'm not responsible at all. Kamash malan, no. Covering doesn't really help protect it from fire. You can't really claim that and you're liable. Basocher idei sheker nami. Case 3. Ma'u detema lema divrei harav divrei hatalmid divrei mishomim. This is a great claim. I hired false witnesses. They go to court and testify for you. Let's say for somebody else, for you. And then they lie. Now, I could say, look, I hired them, but in the end, it was their doing. I told them to do something and pay them money. God told them, don't lie falsely. The Torah says. It's not my fault that they lied in court. Okay, it's a little hard to say that, but it's not my fault. This all goes with the sugya of, which is based on also divrei rav, divrei tamid, divrei mishomim. In the end, they did the sin, so maybe I shouldn't be responsible at all. And maybe I won't be. No. I hired them, and therefore I take responsibility as well. Again, not responsibility in the court of law, but yes, in the heavenly court. Now, what did we assume here? We assumed here that if I would have come forward, Ruth would have to pay Naomi. Why? When does Ruth pay Naomi? If she's not willing to swear. Now, if I'm right, then she probably won't swear falsely. And therefore, if she won't swear if I come forward, she'll actually have to pay Naomi. So I'm causing Naomi a loss. Comes the Gemara now and says, who's to say, if I would testify, have a modeh? The Ruth would say, oh yeah, you're right, I really do owe the money. Dilma have a Mishna shikra. Maybe she would lie falsely. Now, why are we accusing Ruth of lying falsely? Well, in the end, from the beginning, she was lying falsely. We claimed, right? Naomi claimed, Ruth, you owe me money. Ruth said, I don't owe you money. Now, if she lied for that, maybe she'll lie under oath also, right? Usually the oath is a little scarier. People don't like to lie under oath. But maybe she will anyway, in which case I could claim I didn't cause Naomi a loss because maybe Ruth will lie under oath falsely, and then she won't have to pay the money to Naomi. So it's not necessarily me that's causing the loss by not testifying. And maybe then we can't make me liable even in heavenly court. Kamma, that comes to teach you, no, you're liable anyway. So basically, the structure from here to there to now is very simple. We started with the 4 cases in the braita. We had to explain what are the cases and why you're not liable in the hands of in the human court. Once we got to that, okay, we then got to, but there's all these other cases. And then they said, well, now it goes back to the beginning, really. Once we explained that it's a case where it's clear you're not liable in a human court, now they say, well, what's unique about these cases is it's not even clear that you'd be liable in a heavenly court. And that's why the braita had to say them. So what we started with seems like you'd be liable in a human court for these. By the time we've gone through the sugya, we get to the point where we say you might have even thought you're not even liable in a heavenly court for these cases. And then the Gemara is coming and tell you, no, that's why the braita mentioned them, you are. Okay. Now we're moving on to the next part of the Mishna. So that's our summary for this part. We won't go back to this at the end of today's daf. We're now going to keep going through the next cases in the Mishna. So the next case is, we're really not talking about the listing right now. We're talking about somebody breaks, or somehow the gate breaks, not by somebody, not by listing, not by robbers coming, but basically somehow in the middle of the night, the fence breaks. We don't know how. So Rava, we're going to have 2 versions of this. Right now, we think that Rava says it on this line. It's if the animal gets out by digging under the wall and breaking the wall, trying to get out. Okay, so he starts digging to get out and breaks the wall in the process. That's what we're talking about. So now, if that's what we're talking about, it seems to imply, wait. But if it broke for some other reason, not because the animal dug down and tried to get out, but I don't know, a wind came and blew it and knocked it down, something happened, some crazy thing, broke, I'm going to be liable? What's the case? If I built a very solid wall and it broke in the middle of the night, I'm definitely not liable. Why would I be liable? What better protection could I have done? Well, if it was a kotel that was going to fall down anyway, if the animal digs down and breaks it, which according to Rava is the case of the Mishna where we say I'm exempt, why would I be exempt? Even if we say it wasn't expected that the animal was going to dig, but I shouldn't have left a wall that could fall down any moment. And therefore, it's a case of I started off doing something negligent because I left this wall that could have broken. In the end, what happened was onus, because I wasn't to expect that the animal was going to dig down under the wall and break it in that way. It's a very atypical way. But that's onus. Okay, and then now, what's the story? Well, if you say, we know there's a machloket about this kind of case. If you're going to say that's a case where people are exempt, then that explains our Mishna. So that's why I'm exempt. It was a kotel re'uah, and the animal dug under, as Rava said. And that's the only case you're going to be patur. But if you hold that you're liable because you were negligent to begin with, how could you possibly explain this? So we go back to saying, we now say Rava makes no sense because you can't explain it according to saying it was a kotel re'uah if you hold because then you'd actually be liable. So it has to be in a case of a kotel bari because we want to exempt you. It was a solid wall. And then we're going to say it obviously makes no difference if the animal dug under or the animal didn't dig under, if broke some other way. Either which way you could be exempt because you had a nice solid wall. So it can't be that Rava said what he said on that line. So now we're going to take Rava, cut and paste. We're going to say Rava didn't say that line there. We're going to actually do cut, edit, and paste. Okay, that's what we're going to do to Rava. So v'chi itmar de Rava aseifa itmar. Rava actually was on the next line in the Mishnah, which is hinicha. And by the way, before aseifa itmar, which is what hinicha v'chama oshtamascha lechere shotev katam v'yatsav izika patu. If you left the animal in the sun, okay, the second part is not relevant, or you gave it to a chere shotev katam, that's not connected here. But if you left it in the sun and it goes out and damages, you're liable. Now, when are you liable if you left it in the sun? This is why we're editing it. We're not saying only chatra. Originally, we heard him as only chatra, and that raised a whole issue for us. Now we're going to say even chatra. even if the animal digs down under the ground, which is a very atypical, unexpected type thing, doesn't matter. If you left the animal in the sun, you're still liable. Now we have to understand this. What's going on here? In other words, why did he say afilu chatra? Because he was saying, obviously, if lo chatra, and the animal, what's the other option? The animal smashes the wall, right? You leave the animal in a boiling hot sun situation. It's unbearable. The first thing the animal's going to do is barge through the wall, try to break it as best as he can. All his koch. And he could. So that's a case where you're obviously going to be chayav. But comes Rava and he says, even chatra though. Okay? Now, if you say lo mebaya, you don't even need to say lo chatra de kula b'shiur. That's for sure negligent. Ela afilu chatranan. Even if the dog digs down and breaks the wall by digging and gets out and then causes damage, you're still going to be liable. Mao detema, you might have thought. Right? You might have thought maybe this is a case where you were negligent because you put the animal in the sun, but in the end, the animal did some atypical thing that wasn't expected at all. That's onus. To which the Gemara says, no, but this really whole thing is negligence. Why is it negligence? Because you left the animal in the sun. My time at the armale made that the person who the animal damaged their stuff and you try to say, oh, it wasn't my fault, it was honest, can say to you, what are you talking about? You left your animal in the sun. Now you have to assume that when you leave the animal in the sun, the animal's going to try any possible method they have. That's that word, titztika. Any method they have, they're going to use to get out of there, whether it's smashing the wall, whether it's digging under, they're going to just try anything. So any kind of way that they got out is actually going to be your fault. And that's what Rava is saying. So Rava is not saying only chatra, he's saying even chatra, even if the animal digs, and he's not saying on the first line, he's saying it on the second. Next case, so it's your listim chayavim. Now we're up to the next set of cases, which is if a thief comes, breaks your wall, takes an animal out with the robber's own hands, then the robber's liable. Now we assume, what does it mean? The robber's liable for damages, right? If the animal now goes out and damages, then they're liable, or also possibly for the animal itself, right? For the animal running away, like Rashi said with the other case. To which the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't this obvious? We're now in Amud. Isn't this obvious? Now we're going to learn this when we get to Parak Meruba, which is the next chapter, about theft. What happens when someone steals something? They actually acquire ownership rights to it. To the extent, now it's a little bit weird. What? I steal something, it becomes mine? Well, to the extent that I'm liable, and we've seen this before, I become liable for damages. I own it for liability. Okay, which means basically that I have to, let's say something happens to it, I always have to return the object, and I have to return it the way it was when I stole it. Not if it got damaged and now it's worth less. That means I'm responsible for damages. I acquire ownership of it. At what point? So Rashi helps us and tells us, Ika mishicha v'shino reshu. When they take it out of your domain, okay, while I'm still in your domain, I'm in your house and I take your animal, if I'm pulling it, that's not enough. I have to do pulling and changing of domain. So when I get outside and I pull it, I can then say I'm acquiring it. If it's in your reshut, it doesn't work. But once I leave, and that's what the Mishna said, they took it out, which seems like they did Mashiach, they pulled it, which is a kinyan, and it was in some other domain. So shinoi reshut, changing of domain. Well, then it should be mine for all intents and purposes, which means, of course, I'm going to be liable for damages now that I stole it from you. To which they say, in which case, why is the Mishna even telling us this? It's obvious, right? Sometimes they say the Mishna is saying the wrong thing. Here it's saying, well, it's just so obvious, you don't need to say so. Okay, we're going to have two answers. The first answer is, it's not a case where I actually took it with my hands and pulled it out of your domain. No, it's a case where I came into your house to rob you, okay? And what did I do? I blocked the animal in three ways and kind of guided the animal without touching the animal, without pulling the animal. Maybe I touched it, that doesn't matter, but without pulling the animal, I guided it straight to your field, someone else's field, and had the animal eat there. Okay, so that's what it means. I stood in blocking it, basically, and forced the animal without pulling it, so there was no mashicha. So now, and then, basically, we're going to say I'm liable. Now, it's a good question. Why am I liable here for doing this? Some people say that this is in place of Mashicha. It's as if I did Mashicha, it counts as a kinyan because I basically forced the animal to go there. Some people say, what do you mean? That's not Mashicha. So there's a debate about how this works. Some people say it's a unique halacha in Shane of if I guided the animal to a certain place and kind of stuck them there with food in front of them, obviously they were going to eat, and therefore I'm liable, midin Shane, not midin because I stole it and I'm an owner of it, okay? That it's a unique halacha, and then you have to explain where that comes from. It's a whole question, really. Now, where do we get that there's a concept like this? So again, two ways to really understand this answer. Right, what I just explained. Now we're going to say, where do I know that there's a precedent for explaining it like this? The Gemara says, as Rav said about something else, so there's a source that says that if you stand up your animal, actually Rav says this, if you stand up your animal by next to the standing grain of your friend, you're liable. So the Gemara says, Ma'amid Pshita. Obviously, if you stand up an animal next to someone's grain, you're going to be liable. If you did it with your own hands, it's obviously a problem. So what does Ma'amid mean? Lo tzricha. He must have meant de Kamma bape. He must have meant our case. Okay? And there we see, just like they explained Rav as assuming you guided the animal toward there without actually physically moving the animal, and you're liable. That must be the case that we're talking about here as well in our Mishna. But we're going to have a different explanation now. Amarle Abaye Rav Yosef. So Abaye says to Rav Yosef, "He kisha amartlan v'listim nami di kishur." That case that you just brought. Just one sec. Right now, Rav Yosef wasn't here before. No, he's just saying to Rav Yosef, that source of Rav, he explained, is the case of hikisha. What's hikisha? When lots of times when you want the animal to move, you hit them with a stick, and that guides them to go forward. So what he's saying is you hit them with a stick. In the case of Ma'amid, that's what Rav was talking about. And listim also, the listim in our Mishna is the same as we explained Rav, but not the way you explained it, that you just guided it. No, that you actually hit it. That's requiring more action, right? He's saying hitting it, and then most people think that what he means is that's considered Mashicha, okay? It's the Mashicha if you actually hit it with a stick. That's different because that's more action, and he thinks that's what it's talking about and not guiding it. So we have two ways to understand the listim, hotziua listim. Originally, we thought the listim actually physically takes the animal. Now we learn it's two other things that perhaps function in place of Mashicha and work like Mashicha does, even though it's not actually Mashicha. Or perhaps the first one is really just Shane. It's a unique halacha in Shane, and basically then Abaye is coming to say, no, you actually need Mashicha, and it would have to be something more than that, like hitting. Okay, and then he's disagreeing with that could really count as Mashicha. Anyway, like I said, like the beginning of the daf, there's a few different ways to understand this, conceptually what's going on here. Next case. So what we're basically doing in this sugya, let's just review a little bit. What is nifrit sabalayla? What exactly is that case? What's hotziua listim? What's that case? And each time we're going to have some issues here. Right there, we had Rava who explained only if the animal dug, and then we didn't understand that, so we actually said he didn't mean only, and he actually was referring to the case of the son, and not that case at all. And then we had nothing really to say about nifrit sabalayla. And then we have the listim take it out. What does it mean take it out? Isn't that obvious? So we had to explain these two other ways. Okay, if you give it to a ro'eh, nichnas ro'eh taftav, the ro'eh becomes responsible. So who gave it to the ro'eh? Okay, we assume the simple reading is, we've been talking all along, there's an owner of the animal, and all these things happen to the owner of the animal. So Misarul ro'eh means the owner of the animal passed it on to a shepherd. The shepherd becomes responsible if the animal now damages. But the Gemara says, Amrei taftav deman. Who was the ro'eh, the shepherd, replacing? If he was replacing the owner of the animal, Bala Beima, Tanina Chadazimna. We already have a Mishna that says exactly this. Do you remember this Mishna? Shomer chinam sachar. If you pass on your animal to any of the four shomrim, people who watch items, kulam nichnesu tachat ba'alim. They now assume responsibility for liability for this animal. If the animal damages, they're going to have to pay damages. That's exactly this case, passing it on to someone else. Can't be that the Mishna is saying something that appeared in explicit Mishna earlier in the Mishna. Ela tachtav de shomer. It must be coming to say, if I, as the owner of the animal, gave it to someone to watch, let's say you to watch, and you decided to give it to your friend to watch instead, your friend becomes responsible. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute, we know that that's not the case. Shomer Kamma ipatale legamre. If I give it to you to watch and you pass it to someone else, you're exempt from responsibility. I made you responsible. And if we say that really you're exempt from responsibility because you passed it on to someone else who's, assuming they're capable of watching, this raises a question for Rava. We've talked about this before. If a shomer gives it to somebody else, okay, I ask you to watch my item and you pass it on to somebody else, and then it gets damaged, okay, or it does damage or whatever it might be. Well, I can, when in the end, that last shomer says, oh, I'm not, whatever, they try to explain themselves. I say, what are you talking about? I gave it to you to watch. I trusted you. I didn't trust Joe Schmo that you hired. I wanted you to watch my item. So I'm not, you're going to have to pay me. You're responsible. I'm holding you responsible because I gave it to you. Well, who are you to go give it to somebody else? Right? This is a great thing about delegating, right? You delegate to someone and they delegate to someone else. And then they come back to you and say, why didn't you do it? And you say, well, I told them to do it. They didn't do it. But in the end, really, you should be responsible for it. That's what Rava says. So now we have a problem because if we understand our Mishna, we can't explain the Mishna as the owner gives it to the ro'eh. And the ro'eh is responsible, not the owner, because that already there's a Mishna. But if we explain it that it's the ro'eh gave to somebody else, well, that's shomer shemasar the shomer. Rava, that seems to say our Mishna goes against Rava. Now, it's not a problem with our Mishna, it's a problem with Rava, and then Rava doesn't make sense. How could Rava possibly say this in light of our Mishna? So, Amar Lacha Rava, my Masara l'ro'eh, Rava could say, this is how you read. What's the case of Masara l'ro'eh? It's not that you gave it to Joe Schmo. It's that you gave it lebarzile. You gave it to your helper. Now, when I give you something to watch, I don't assume you're going to watch it 24/7. I might assume you have people who work under you and you're going to give it to one of your workers. That already is not shomer samashal the shomer. It's not like you gave it to some random person. When I gave it to you, I assumed you and whoever works under you. That's a different story. Then the other person who works under you is fully responsible. And I can't claim, oh, I didn't want to watch it yet, because why would I have given it to you if I didn't trust your workers? Okay, that's the first reading of the sugya. Now we're going to have a totally different reading of the sugya. Same Rava, same issue with the barzilei, with the apprentice, the assistant, but it's going to be read, it's going to start off differently and end differently. We've seen a lot of sugyas like this. Because it specifically says you give it to a shepherd, and it doesn't say you gave it to somebody else, it seems like it must be that you gave it to a shepherd and the shepherd gave it to his shepherd, meaning the guy who works under him. And then, right, to orche leroe dimimsar the barzilei, because that's typical to do. And that's why the barzilei will be held responsible. We're basically starting the sugya the way we ended the previous one. Avala acher lo, but if he gives it to some random person, or she gives it to some random person, the shepherd that you gave it to, then the shepherd assumes full responsibility. The one that I told, if I told the shepherd to watch it and they give it to some random person, that shepherd assumes responsibility. And that's not the case in our Mishna. The case in our Mishna is only when they passed it on to someone who works under them. In which case, we're going to now say, oh, in that case, lema mesayale la Rava. Then this should prove Rava. This should be support for Rava, this Mishna, the opposite of the previous. Dama Rava, shomer shemasar the shomer chayav. You see, we're basically going from the end of the sugya backwards, going in reverse. And therefore, this proves Rava, because Rava said, shomer shemasar the shomer chayav. And this says, only the ro'eh who gives to his barzilei is patur. But if he gave it to somebody else, they would be liable. Then the shepherd assumes all responsibility. Amre lo. So then they say, no, our Mishnah doesn't necessarily prove Rava. Why? It could be he was just giving the average typical case. What would be a normal case? The shepherd would give it to someone of his team to watch. And therefore, that's the average case. And that's the case the Mishnah mentioned. But it doesn't mean that if the shepherd gave it to someone else, the original shepherd would still be responsible. No, maybe they could pass it over and then it would approve Rava at all. So we have two ways of reading it, and they each come to opposite conclusions. Is shomer l'masar shomer shemasar the shomer in the first one we concluded is actually not right? Is actually shomer shemasar the shomer is going to be liable. In this one, we explain perhaps a shomer shemasar the shomer, maybe that is our case in the Mishnah, and you're actually not liable. You really can't pass over responsibility, and that's a machloket in a different place. Rava says you're liable, but other people disagree. I don't remember who disagrees with him there, but think that you're actually no. If as long as it wasn't a cheresho ter katan or someone who doesn't know how to watch it, it's actually fine. Last sugya for today. Itmar, shomer aveda. This is something you might not have thought about if you've never really learned Elo Mitzio, which is the second chapter in Bava Mitzio, one of the first prakim people often learn when they learn Gemara, which is all about lost items. Now, when you find a lost item, you have to return it. But until such time that you return it, let's say you find an animal you have to feed that animal and take care of that animal. And you have to, if you have a rug of someone, you have to shake it out so it doesn't get moldy. And you have responsibilities for this lost item. So shomer aveda, the question here is, what level of liability do you assume as watching someone's lost item? Now, nobody hired you to watch it. On the other hand, the Torah says you have to keep it and return it to them, right, when you find the owner. So until that point, you actually have to watch it. Otherwise, it'll get ruined. So Rabba amal kishomer chinam. Rabba says you're like a shomer chinam. You're like someone who's watching and not getting paid because you're not getting paid for this, right? That makes the most sense. Now, shomer chinam, you might remember we talked about this, is not going to be liable if it gets stolen or lost from you. You can go to court and say, I swear it was stolen or lost, and you don't have to compensate them. Rav Yosef amal kishomer sachar dami. It's as if you're getting paid. Now, this is weird. Why are you as if you're getting paid? We're going to have to figure that out in a minute. But you're now going to be liable. A shomer sachar, if you get paid for watching an item, if it gets lost or stolen, you have to replace it. So now it's crazy. You find an item, you take it, you don't watch it properly, it gets stolen, you now have to pay for it. Okay? That's crazy. So Rabba Amar kishomer chinam dami. Why? My hana'a kamma. If you're not getting any benefits, of course you're like a shomer chinam. Rav Yosef Amar kishomer sachar dami. And now we're going to have two explanations. The first one, we saw this again, sukkah. If you remember, we learned about osek min mitzvah patur min mitzvah. You're involved in a mitzvah, you're exempt from another mitzvah. Fascinating topic. And basically, we say that while you're watching this lost item and you're dealing, let's say you're feeding the animal, and someone knocks at your door and they're a poor person, you don't have to answer the door. So you're actually benefiting because while you're busy with this mitzvah, you're exempt from doing another mitzvah, and you don't have to pay money to a poor person who comes knocking at your door. Very strange case, the fact that this happens all at the same time, right? Some people think that just because you're watching a lost item in your house, that immediately exempts you anytime, even if you can do both of them. And that's a big debate about osek min mitzvah, patur min mitzvah. Do you have to do both or not? Okay, is this a requirement to try to get everything in? Or once you're doing one, you're obligated, you're not obligated to the other. And what if it's a mitzvah that's kind of all the time? Does that exempt you from other mitzvah? Most people think no, but there is some, the Ran has some unique opinion there, which we discussed when we learned it in Sukkah. So you're getting reward by the fact that you don't have to do other things while you're involved in that mitzvah. Some people explain Rav Yosef differently. Rav Yosef amar shomer sachar dami, since the Torah forced you to do this against your will, you're like a shomer sachar. Now, what does that have to do with getting paid because the Torah forced you? Well, it could be. There's different ways of understanding this. I'll give you one way, which is because the Torah insisted that you watch this item until you return it. Obviously, the Torah demanded of you the highest level of shmirah, which is the shomer sachar. Not that you're actually getting rewarded for it, but because the Torah demanded something, it must be they demand the highest level. Okay, one could argue with it. There's other ways to understand it. We'll leave it at that. So what we did in the second part of today's class was go through these cases, right? What's the Rabba v'hu shachatra? Which case was he referring to, and what did he mean? Only that, or maybe even that. Then the listim, what's that case, right? And then what's the right? What there really wasn't Mashiach, otherwise it would be obvious. And what were they trying to teach you? Which cases? Then we had the ro'eh to the ro'eh, right? And that whether it proves Rava or doesn't prove Rava. And then whether that means only if he gave to his apprentice, he's not going to be liable anymore, even if he gave to somebody else. And then we had the shomer aveda. If you're watching someone's lost item, what level of responsibility do you assume? That we finished today's daf. Wishing everyone a good day, hoping for better news. Hard days these days, and hoping for better news and hoping for quieter times. Wishing everyone a good day.